What's up? I want to talk about Susan Sontag's On Photography. Let me move this light a little bit. I'm only going to focus on the first chapter, and I wanted to say hello to my friend Chichi. She gave me this book 4 years ago, and I finally got to read it last year. And after I was done, I gave her a call, and she was like, wouldn't it be amazing to have an updated edition with how the internet might have changed things up? And that would be amazing, I think. This book was published in 1977. It really reminded me of the way I first encountered photographs while growing up in the 80s and what made me fall in love with the medium in the first place. But I'm not so sure if this holds true for people today. You know, it's not only the way we come in contact with photography that has changed, but the values with the medium itself and how much we trust it. You know, we all know what Photoshop is capable of doing. So basically, I've actually picked some ideas of her and I'll flag them as relevant, or they might need revising. I absolutely love this book. I think it's very easy to read and the ideas are very clearly laid out. Sometimes the structure can be a little bit predictable, but that's fine. It's not a biggie. She's as smart as they come, and I really don't know how Sontag has accumulated this amount of knowledge about photography and formed this rock-solid opinion about the medium without being a photographer herself. There are many ways in which this book and Camera Lucida by Roland Barthes have completely changed the way I feel about the medium, and I don't think there's going back. The first chapter is called In Plato's Cave. Plato's Cave is an allegory presented by the Greek philosopher Plato in his work Republic to compare, quote, the effect of education and the lack of it on our nature, end quote. Thanks, Wikipedia. Basically, some people have been prisoners in a cave pretty much their entire lives, and all they can see are shadows projected on the wall. These are the only representations of reality they have. It seems natural to compare these shadows to photographs, and Sontag goes back to the importance of photographs in shaping the way we see the world at different points in this chapter. This idea still holds true today, whether it's on the iPad given to a kid at a dinner table or advertising posters we see while commuting back and forth from work. We're still brainwashed to believe something is beautiful and desirable. I don't think this is ever going to change, unfortunately. Slavoj Zizek has something interesting to say about this. Link here and down in the video description if you want to see it later. He's asked about John Carpenter's movie They Live, in which John Nara finds a box of sunglasses that reveal the hidden messages in signage and advertising. Photography is just as good at brainwashing today as it was in 1977. And what Zizek refers to as today's ideological discourse has been around since Sontag's time. Sontag then talks about how photography fiddles with the scale of the world. Scale is an interesting one because it's something that can go unnoticed because it seems kind of obvious. Luigi Ghirri, the Italian photographer, has written about the little man when landscapes are photographed in this collection of essays recently translated to English. At some point, like I think 15 years ago, people started using either large format cameras or digital post-processing to emulate the tilt-shift effect and shooting cityscapes or even landscapes from above and making them look like dioramas. It's such a gimmick, but you know, it's another way of playing with scale. Actually, scale is yet another variable to play with within context, like for example in an installation or exhibition like Wolfgang Tillmans does when he makes a lifeline look as large and hopefully as meaningful as a beautiful sunset at the beach, or an ass and a scrotum larger than a car. Finally, scale can be used with subtlety in a book, displacing rhythm. Like for example, recently I got this book on the mail by Henry Wessel, and I was struck at how this photograph looks kind of like a miniature. Maybe because the houses look so homogeneous, but also because I had been habituated to a different sense of scale by the rest of the book. We have also to consider that scale in photography was largely limited by technology during Sontag's time. Like a fine art large print was a novelty in the 70s, and the culmination for the quest for larger photographs reached its peak the same year this book was published. A 35mm photograph taken by Ernst Haas was blown up with analog methods, of course, requiring a 5-hour exposure using the Kodak Colorama process. The transparency was 5.5 by 18.2 meters and was backlit by 61,000 watts of light. Still environmentally friendly if we compare it to Bitcoin mining. I'm mixing representation of scale and size of print here, but I think they are kind of intertwined. Although today we just need a gesture with the fingers to maximize our device's screen and get as close as we can to what interests us in a photo. This in itself is another way of playing with scale in photography. So yeah, maybe not as much because of the technological thing, but still relevant. Sontag then goes on to write about how photos are physical objects, like prints that age and fade. And she also mentions that they are used in packaging but want to be packaged themselves, like in photo albums. So my first reaction to this was like, it's not really necessarily applicable to today because photos don't really fade in a cloud or in a hard drive. Although I've had photos being corrupted in an SD card. I am still attached to the physicality of photos when they're in books or negatives. But I think that might have to do with A, the fact that I'm a photographer, and B, my age. So when I was reading this chapter, I was at the bar and Dave behind the counter actually was telling me a story about his daughter. She's 13 and she got a bunch of photos printed for her friend that it was her birthday. So I was like, maybe it's not so passé as I might think. I know this seems anecdotal, but the massive resurgence of film photography that we're all seeing, like the lab where I get all my stuff, my color stuff developed, is opening a branch in the city. So, I'm not saying the physical photography is making a comeback and it's going to replace digital, nothing like that, but I think people are complex enough to appreciate analog photography beyond convenience. Mind you, there's quite a few hipsters in Melbourne. Anyway, it's still relevant. Something that has definitely changed is how photography can work as evidence in the eye of the average layman. We know there's forensic photography and we've seen celebrity mugshots go viral. But this is not because of photography's value as evidence, but because of how we've internalized accountability of whoever's sharing the image. When a mugshot becomes viral, we know it's legit. Sontag says that even if photographs are able to incriminate, we're skeptical of them having this power until we see them, which was really rare in the 70s. Unless you were a cop, you wouldn't see incriminating photographs. She says that we know something has happened if there is a photo of it. Today, video has taken a much more important role incriminating, partly because it's much harder to tamper with video, but also because it takes less skill to describe something that's happening with footage than it does to catch the decisive moment photographically. Also, there's more people with video capabilities in their pockets now than ever. Video gives us clearer disclosure, but I'm not so sure it's more insightful once we know what has actually gone down. A pretty obvious example is the very detailed image of Lee Harvey Oswald being shot, contrasted to the impressionistic footage of the event. On the flip side, we don't trust something has happened because there's a photo of it. From Instagram influencers altering the way their body looks, to professional Magnum accredited photojournalists like Steve McCurry altering his images, photography's reputation as a communicator of the real has been tarnished to the point that it seems a medium just as good as fiction these days, a status a lot of the art world's gatekeepers are unwilling to accept. It seems more interesting to me to appreciate how truthful the fiction is, not whether it is real or constructed. So this bit needs to be revised. One of the big ideas in this chapter is the notion that photographs are not interpretations of the world, but a part of it. Like, this seems an obvious thing to write, but I've realized that the fact that photography has become increasingly fictitious has made me personally forget that taking a photo is a form of collecting the world, a piece of it, capturing a person and the way they look and owning it, like in your pocket or in your drawer, which is a disturbingly powerful way of looking at it. Quote, "What is written about a person or an event is frankly an interpretation, as are handmade visual statements like paintings and drawings. Photographed images do not seem to be statements about the world so much as pieces of it, miniatures of reality that anyone can make or acquire." End quote. The same photons that bounced off a person's face and went through the lens alter the emotion forever. But then she notes that even during the 30s, editing and directing was an important part of what a photograph is able to document. Quote, "The immensely gifted members of the Farm Security Administration photographic project of the late 1930s Among them, Walker Evans, Dorothea Lange, Ben Shahn, Russell Lee would take dozens of frontal photos of one of their sharecropper subjects until satisfied that they had gotten just the right look on film, the precise expression on the subject's face that supported their own notions about poverty, light, dignity, texture, exploitation, and geometry. In deciding how a picture should look, in preferring one exposure to another, photographers are always imposing standards on their subjects." End quote. Both of these ideas are very much still relevant today, especially when using traditional methods. That is possibly one of the reasons why analog photography might have had a comeback. You know, when you look at a photo that is blatantly taken on film, you're less likely to doubt it. As opposed to a photo that looks super sharp and clean like a digital capture, right? Sontag is of the opinion that, quote, "there is an aggression implicit in every use of the camera. This is as evident in the 1840s and 1850s, photography's glorious first 2 decades, as in all the succeeding decades, during which technology made possible an ever-increasing spread of that mentality which looks at the world as a set of potential photographs," end quote. There are still people that believe in this opinion, so it's still relevant. I don't believe in this aggression, and for all its poetic persuasiveness, the parallel between cameras and guns that is often drawn doesn't amount to much. Sontag also draws a parallel between the way cars are advertised and cameras are advertised. I don't know. I am quite skeptical of analogies in general. I think they're good to convince people of certain things or to help memory, like as a mnemonic device, but not so insightful in general. Guns destroy, cameras perpetuate. Henry Wessel has a beautiful way of putting it. Pressing the shutter is saying yes to the world. I only perceive taking a photograph as an act of aggression if the person behind the camera is wearing a uniform or looks violently unartistic. Although I'm sure a lot of people would say that about me, so whatever.
Quote, "Recently, photography has become almost as widely practiced an amusement as sex and dancing, which means that, like every mass art form, photography is not practiced by most people as an art. It is mainly a social right, a defense against anxiety, and a tool of power."
Needs revision. Either people were having a ton of sex in the 70s or we're taking way too many photos today. But the differential for people I know is quite significant, like pretty much everyone. Also, we take way more photos now, of course, than people ever did with analog cameras. Now, the social right aspect of photography, I think, has largely disappeared. And, you know, taking photographs is a seamless part of any day, memorable or not. Finally, if anything, images are more anxiety-inducing today than a defense against it, mostly because of exposure through social media and how we get numbers and how we can compare our engagement with others. She has a really funny bit about tourists taking photos that is still very much relevant. Apparently, tourism, like large groups of tourists, was a novelty back in the 70s, and until before COVID, much of what she observed remained unchanged. Her succinct line is, quote, "travel becomes a strategy for accumulating photographs," end quote. I wonder if digital nomads today would go through the aggravation of travel if it couldn't be commodified into a social media following. Sontag describes the typical tourist as someone without an opinion that uses the camera to certify their trip. Quote, "This gives shape to the experience. Stop, take a photograph, and move on. The method specially appeals to people handicapped by ruthless work ethic. Germans, Japanese, and Americans," end quote. Okay, this bit is a bit contentious. She contrasts photos that incite masturbation, like pornography and even advertising, to images that raise moral conscience, you know, turn on versus turn off. I always thought that this was only a boys' thing, mainly because I grew up in an environment where there was quite a bit of shame associated with female sexuality, and honestly, most objectifying done by the media seemed to cater to a male audience. Sontag says that there's no history of desire because it stands in the immediate foreground of all experience, and it is awakened by archetypes, as opposed to images that quote-unquote mobilize conscience, that are always linked to a specific historical situation. We'll talk about these historical images quite a bit more in a minute. I just wish she went a bit further with this idea of desire, because it seems like a psychological theory that I don't know much about. But I thought she was basically implying that, say, a Russian oligarch and an Irish farmer from 2 centuries ago would be turned on by the same images, completely untethered of how they were culturally nurtured. And I'm not so sure if I agree with this. I don't know. If you know anything, let me know. Instead, she focuses on political photos taken, like the ones by Matthew Brady of the American Civil War, and how they didn't make people not participate in it. How Andersonville photos of famished war prisoners only inflamed the opinion the North already had of the South. And Dorothea Lange's photographs of second-generation Japanese Americans being moved to concentration camps in 1942 were not recognized as documents of the American government committing a crime against a group of citizens until the 1960s. She claims that this is because the 1940s were overwhelmed by a pro-war and anti-Japanese sentiment in the States, and Lange's photographs were unable to raise awareness. Quote, "Photographs cannot create a moral position, but they can reinforce one and can help build a nascent one." End quote. The mention of Dorothea Lange is very interesting. I am linking down in the video description an abridged version of the introductory essay to Impounded, Dorothea Lange and the Censored Images of the Japanese American Internment. In it, and in other articles I've read online, there is a claim that 97% of these images were censored by the US Army till they resurfaced 2 years after Susan Sontag's death in 2006. So she was basing this observation on the 3% that would have actually been used in the 40s that slipped through censorship. We have to assume that this was because they were diplomatic and, they wouldn't have really captured the suffering of the Japanese Americans being quote-unquote relocated. This is exactly what I mean with this woman. That is such a niche, insightful and nuanced reading of photographic history that you gotta wonder how she ever had time to do anything else. I know photography was one of her big interests, but she also wrote fiction and wrote about some other subjects as well, so it's pretty impressive. Amongst these mentions of how different historical events were photographed, she notes that, quote, "Photographs may be more memorable than moving images because they are a neat slice of time, not a flow. Television is a stream of underselected images, each of which cancels its predecessor." End quote. And then she exemplifies with the public revulsion the running Vietnamese girl photo had, contrasted to hundreds of hours of televised barbarities. I've already talked about what I think how, video has kind of replaced photography in a lot of ways today, but it's worth reiterating. In 1977, printed media had a wider proliferation than video content. We still have the medium in which Nick Ut's The Terror of War would have been printed. Newspapers, magazines, books, posters, flyers. But let's face it, printed media in general is being replaced by our phones. And according to much research done by different outlets, video creates more engagement than still images in the digital realm. So, needs revising. I'll go on with this chapter in another video. I haven't dealt with all the subjects she writes about, but just the ones that jumped out to me. You should all go and read the book because your reading might catch a lot of stuff I missed. So yeah, like the video, subscribe, and I'll see you next week.